I still remember the night the wind howled like a wounded animal outside our old farmhouse, rattling the windows as if it wanted to come in and hear our secrets. And that was the night my whole world began to unravel. The night my son's eyes turned into something I didn't recognize. My name is Eleanor Mae Whitfield, and I've lived long enough to know that families don't crumble all at once. They fracture quietly, one whispered confession at a time. I was 82 when the truth came for us, but the story really began decades earlier, back when I was a girl who believed the world could never turn against her. I grew up in a small town in Kansas, the kind of place where everyone knew the shade of your curtains and the sound of your mother's voice calling you home for supper. My mother had hands that smelled like bread and earth. My father, a temper that could split the silence in two. By 15, I had already learned that love was both salvation and punishment. Then came Harold Whitfield, tall and brown-eyed, with a voice that sounded like a promise you wanted to believe. He was 2 years back from the war, haunted in quiet ways, his mind still stranded on faraway shores even when his boots were on our soil. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes out of hope, not wisdom. Our wedding was small, June of 52, underneath the cottonwoods, the preacher trembling in the heat, and the whole town came to watch old scars pretend they could heal. We built a life the way other people built fences, out of whatever scraps the wind didn't take. Harold worked at the grain mill while I sewed dresses for the neighbors' girls, and for many years, I believed the silence between us meant peace. But silence is never peace. It is everything that hasn't been said sharpening its edges. Our firstborn, Samuel, came into the world on a gray September morning, wailing like the heavens had already told him that this earth was not an easy home. He had Harold's eyes, calm, steady, almost too knowing for a child, and as he grew, I often wondered what truths they had already seen. When he was 8, he stopped talking to his father entirely after one night neither of them ever spoke about again. I knew Harold had struck him, though he swore to me he hadn't. The boy wore his bruises like secrets, hidden but throbbing beneath his sleeves. I spent nights listening to the creak of floorboards, to Samuel's breathing in the dark, whispering prayers that never seemed to reach past the ceiling. The years rolled like slow thunder. Harold's mind began to rust with bitterness, and our home became a quiet battlefield where no one ever won. Then there was Mary, our second child, who grew with laughter in her bones, a burst of sunlight in a house too used to storms. She was the thread keeping us together, though none of us realized it at the time. It wasn't until Harold's death, sudden and merciful, that I saw how deep the fractures had run. Samuel stayed away for years after the funeral, calling only on Christmas with a voice that sounded older than his age. I thought absence was his peace, his way of healing from what this house had done to him, but I was wrong. When he finally returned, 30 years later, gray-threaded and hollow-eyed, he carried something darker than grief. I remember stirring soup on the stove when he said, "Mama, we need to talk," and something in his tone made my hands freeze midair. He looked at me with that same calmness he had as a boy. Only this time it was the calm before a storm I didn't know how to survive. He told me there was something he'd hidden all his life, something about Harold about those nights I thought I heard the wind crying. But it wasn't just about his father. It was about me too. That truth would split our family open like a wound that never truly closed. And as he began to speak, his voice trembling like the first crack in ice, I realized that love, the kind I had clung to all those years, can drown a soul just as easily as save it. And before that night was over, I would come to understand that sometimes the people we raise carry not our dreams, but our sins. I remember the way the lamp flickered that night, casting long trembling shadows on the kitchen walls, as if even the light itself knew the truth was about to break through decades of silence. Samuel sat across from me, his hands twisting around his coffee cup. Not drinking, not blinking, just staring into the dark swirl of memories that none of us had ever dared to name. He said, "Mama, I need you to listen, and I need you to believe me." And though my heart already beat like a warning drum, I nodded. There are moments in life when everything you love stands on the edge of a single sentence. That was one of them. His voice shook when he spoke Harold's name, like he was summoning a ghost he both feared and needed to face. "It wasn't just the hitting, Mama," he said. "It was what he wanted me to do." I felt my entire body stiffen, my breath catch, and in that instant, every sound in the house, the ticking clock, the wind outside, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed to vanish. There are truths that don't fit inside a human heart, but still you try to hold them, because letting them fall means losing everything you thought you knew. He told me that after Harold broke his hand one winter, an accident with a rusty machine at the mill, he made Samuel take his place, working nights, running grain sacks twice his size, coming home before dawn so no one would know. I could still hear the rasp in Harold's voice on those tattered mornings when he'd say, "Samuel's got to toughen up," and how I had simply nodded, foolish and blind with trust. But it wasn't the work that scarred him. It was the secret Harold made him keep. "He told me not to tell you about the money, Mama," Samuel said. "He made me deliver something to the station every Friday. Brown envelopes, always sealed." But after a while, I started to notice the faces waiting for me. Men who weren't from around here. I pressed my hand to my chest because I had long suspected Harold wasn't just dealing grain. You don't live through decades of marriage without learning to smell deceit. But I had turned away from that scent each time, thinking it kinder to pretend. Tears prickled my eyes as Samuel went on. He got in deep, Mama. He took loans from men who didn't forgive debts, and when he couldn't pay, they made me do it. They made me take things for them, drive trucks, carry boxes. I was 15. My voice wouldn't come when I tried to answer, so I just listened, trembling with guilt. He paused, staring down at the floor, and the next words fell like stones into my chest. "That's why I left, Mama, because I thought they'd come after you next." The wind outside roared like the sky itself had heard his confession. For all those years I had called my son selfish for his distance, cursed him for abandoning his family, not knowing he was saving us by staying away. I wanted to reach for his hands, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but there was something else in his eyes, something that hadn't yet been said. "Mama, I didn't just run away," he whispered. "Before I left, I did something." The silence stretched, trembling like a blade between us. That night, I went to the mill. I found one of those men, one of the ones who used to wait by the station, and I hurt him. Bad. My heart stuttered in fear, yet my love for him, fierce and boundless, refused to weaken. I tried to say his name, but he continued before I could. He was still breathing when I left, he said. At least I thought he was. But a week later, I heard he was dead. I didn't mean to. God knows I didn't, but after that, I couldn't stay. And Harold, your husband, he made it all worse. He told the men where to find me, Mama. He sold me out. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stop the sob clawing its way out. The man I had loved, the one I had buried with trembling prayers, had betrayed his own blood. But why? I managed to whisper through the ache. Samuel's face was gray with regret. He thought if he handed me over, they'd forgive his debt. Only they wanted more than money. They wanted control, and he gave it to them. I could feel my world cracking apart like old porcelain, all the years of trust and forgiveness splintering into dust. But before I could gather the courage to summon one word of comfort, Samuel said the thing that sealed our fate forever. Mama, I didn't tell you everything. That man I hurt that night, it wasn't just some stranger. It was someone you knew. And with that, every memory, every breath of my past began to tremble, waiting for the truth that would burn everything left standing. The way Samuel's voice broke on that last sentence still echoes in my bones, like a piano key struck too hard and left ringing in an empty hall. And for the first time in my 82 years, I was afraid of my own child. The fire in the hearth flickered low, its light touching the lines on his face. And though I told myself he was still that boy who once brought me wildflowers after every storm, I knew something had changed. I leaned forward slowly, whispering, "Who was it, Samuel? Who was the man?" And for a long moment, he just stared at the floor, tears rolling down his cheeks without sound, as though naming it would turn the air to ash. Then he said it, barely audible, but enough to carve itself into the marrow of my heart. It was Reverend Thomas. I felt like the room tilted, like the past I thought I knew had begun to dissolve around me. Reverend Thomas, the man who baptized my children, who buried my husband, who once told me that forgiveness was the only thing separating us from ruin. That can't be, I breathed, but the look in Samuel's eyes said otherwise. He wasn't the man you thought he was, Mama, he said softly. I found out what he was doing, the way he used his sermons to mask his business with those men from the station. He was laundering the money, Harold's money, too, and when I tried to stop it, things got out of hand. He fought me. I didn't go there to kill him, I swear it. I just wanted to make him confess. His words spun like thorns around my lungs. The Reverend had always been the town's moral compass, the one people went to for salvation. And now I was staring at the truth that my husband and my preacher had been entwined in something far darker than sin. My throat burned with shame, not because of what Samuel had done, but because I had lived all those years in the center of evil and never seen it for what it was. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, and he looked at me with a haunted kind of pity. Because I didn't want to destroy you, Mama, he whispered. You already lost enough. He meant Harold, But the truth was, I had lost far more than a husband. I had lost the idea of good men, the illusion that faith protects you from decay. The memory of Reverend Thomas's funeral flashed through my mind, his casket draped in lilies, the whole town crying, me standing beside Mary while Samuel stayed hidden, his name whispered like shame through the pews. I remembered feeling angry that he hadn't come home for the burial, never knowing he was grieving in silence for something much worse than guilt. "There's more," Samuel said, voice trembling. "After I left town, I tried to start over, but they found me, Mama. One of the men who worked for Thomas, he tracked me down in Oklahoma. He said it wasn't over, that I owed them for the mess at the mill. So I did what I had to do." My breath caught again as I saw the hollowness behind his eyes. "What did you do?" I whispered. He hesitated before replying. I gave them what they wanted. Information about the church, about where the Reverend kept his accounts. But, Mama, I also gave them something else. My hands began to shake, the teacup rattling against its saucer. "What could you possibly have given them?" He swallowed hard. "I gave them names, men from our town who worked with him, men I thought were guilty. Only later I realized one of them wasn't." He looked at me then with unbearable sorrow. "It was George Miller, Mama." I froze. George had been my brother, the boy who'd shared his bread when times were lean, who carried me across flooded creeks when we were children. He had gone missing 30 years ago, and the sheriff had told us he probably ran off after a gambling debt. But now, sitting across from my son, I understood something terrible. "It was because of you," I said, not as accusation, but as awful realization. Samuel's eyes flooded with tears. "I didn't know, Mama. I swear I didn't know. They told me he was one of them. I thought I was protecting us." The room felt smaller, the air thick with ghosts. I wanted to scream, to undo the years, to forgive him, but all I could do was sit there trembling as generations of pain coiled through my blood. The sins of my husband had driven my son to vengeance, and in that vengeance he had damned the last of my family. Everything I thought I had buried came clawing back. The night herald didn't come home. The letters I'd burned unread. The whispers in town. It all made sense now. Harold, Reverend Thomas, George. They were all part of the same rotten branch, and the fruit of it was my son. I stood up slowly, the weight of truth pressing on my chest like wet stone, and looked at Samuel, my beautiful, broken boy. "You didn't destroy me, Samuel," I said quietly. "You destroyed what was left of the lie." And as he covered his face, breaking apart in the dim light of the kitchen, I understood that this was our inheritance, not land or love, but the haunting silence of everything we dared to keep secret for too long. The night after Samuel's confession stretched into a silence so deep I could hear time breathing, and in that hollow space between truth and forgiveness, I felt the ghosts of everyone we'd lost gathering around us like moths drawn to the faint glow of sorrow. He slept in his old room that night, though his sleep wasn't what I'd call it. He lay there motionless, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if afraid that closing them would drag him back into the years he'd tried to forget. I sat by the window till dawn, watching the sky bruise into morning, my heart tightening with every fragile memory. When the first light broke, I went to make breakfast, because that's what mothers do even when the world has ended. We stir, we fry, we pretend the smell of coffee can hold the pieces together. The kitchen felt heavy with his words, the scent of betrayal hanging thick in the air. I kept waiting for him to come downstairs, but an hour passed, then two, and all I could hear was the clock ticking like it was counting our sins. When I finally went to his room, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a folded letter. His hands were trembling. "It came a week ago," he said, handing it to me. The paper was old, softened from being opened and refolded too many times. It wasn't his handwriting, it was Mary's. My daughter, my bright, laughing girl who had moved to Chicago years earlier and rarely wrote more than a card at Christmas. I started to read, my voice cracking halfway through her first line. "Mama, I need to tell you something about Samuel." My heart stopped cold. The letter went on to say that months before Samuel returned home, Mary had received a call from a man in Oklahoma, someone claiming to know our family. The man had told her that Samuel wasn't who he said he was anymore, that he had changed his name and taken on other people's secrets, exchanging one burden for another. Mary hadn't believed it at first, but then the man sent her proof. Documents, ledgers, even photographs of Samuel working under a false identity in a warehouse that wasn't as innocent as it looked. "Mama," her letter read, "I'm scared of what he might have done to protect us." I looked up from the page, hands shaking, searching my son's face for an answer he couldn't form. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he said softly. "I've been helping some of those men still, not by choice, by debt. The same kind of work Harold used to do. I thought if I did it for long enough, they'd leave us alone." His words cut through me like glass. "You kept the same poison alive," I whispered, tears spilling. "After everything that's happened, you're still tangled up in their world." He nodded, shame dimming his eyes. "I tried to stop, Mama. But you don't understand. They never let you out." "Not really. They said if I didn't deliver one last shipment, they'd come for Mary. I couldn't lose her, too." The realization hit me hard as thunder. That letter wasn't just a warning, it was a plea. Mary knew more than she'd let on. Somewhere out there, she was still in danger. I looked at Samuel, desperate to believe redemption was still possible. "Then we go to the police," I said. "We tell them everything." His face twisted with dread. "No, Mama, these aren't petty criminals. They're tied to people in power. The same kind of men Harold worked for, only worse. The police can't protect us." I stood there, staring out the window as the morning light spilled across the dying fields, and I realized the past had wrapped its hands around our throats, dragging us back into the same tragedy we'd spent a lifetime trying to escape. I thought of Harold, of George, of Reverend Thomas, each man swallowed by greed, by secrets, by the illusion of control. Now it was Samuel's turn, and maybe mine too. I couldn't lose another child. "Tell me their names," I said, steady and cold, and Samuel hesitated before whispering three of them. One I recognized immediately. Sheriff Dale Coleman. My breath caught. The very man who had investigated George's disappearance, the man who preached justice like gospel, was the one who had been protecting the same rot underneath this town for decades. "He's the one who warned me not to come back," Samuel confessed. "Said you'd never believe me anyway." I turned toward him, something fierce and ancient burning through my old bones. "You don't know what a mother will believe when it comes to her children," I said. "If that man thinks he can bury another truth in this town, he's wrong." For the first time in years, I felt clarity, a sharp, terrible clarity that comes when the heart decides to stop waiting for miracles and starts fighting for whatever light remains. I walked to the dresser, pulled out Harold's old pistol, the one wrapped in a wool scarf since the day of his funeral, and laid it gently on the table between us. "No more lies," I said. "No more running. If this town wants to eat its young again, it's going to have to get through me first." Samuel looked at me, half in fear, half in awe, as if seeing me not as the fragile mother he left behind, but as the woman he'd always underestimated, the woman who had outlived wars, heartbreak, and silence itself. And when he said my name, softly, almost reverently, I felt the earth tilt, knowing the battle for our family's soul had only just begun. By the next morning, the clouds hung low over the hills like bruises on the sky, and every sound, the creak of the porch, the crow's cries in the distance, felt sharpened, aware, as though the air itself knew something was coming. I stood in the doorway holding Harold's pistol, my hands heavier not from the metal, but from the weight of what I was about to do. Samuel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the gun like it was a piece of our past come back to judge him. "Mama, we don't have to do this," he said, his voice steadier than his eyes. "We can leave, start over somewhere else." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But no one escapes the kind of poison that seeps into bloodlines. No matter how far you go, it finds you. "Running's what killed us the first time," I said, my tone hard and low. "Every secret this family's buried has grown teeth, Samuel. It's time we stop feeding it." He closed his eyes, sighing like a man older than the earth, and when he opened them again, I caught a flicker of the boy he used to be. The boy who once wept against my chest after Harold's anger sent him bleeding into my arms. "Then we face them together," he said. I nodded, though a part of me knew fate had already chosen which of us it would keep. We drove into town as the fog began to lift, the road winding like an old scar. The streets looked smaller than I remembered, reduced by years and sorrow. Children played outside the church, unaware of the ghost that lingered beneath its foundation. And in that moment, I thought of Reverend Thomas's sermons, the way he'd spoken of salvation while hiding sin behind every word. The courthouse tower loomed ahead, its flag, faded and frayed, snapping weakly in the wind, a symbol stripped of grace. We parked behind the sheriff's office. I told Samuel to stay in the car while I went inside, but he refused, his hand tightening on my shoulder. "If we fall," he said, "we fall together." I tried to smile, though the edges of my heart trembled. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and dust. Sheriff Dale Coleman sat behind his desk, a man swollen with years of unchecked power. His eyes flicked from me, to Samuel, and the smirk that stretched his mouth told me he already knew why we were there. "Well, Whitfields," he drawled. "I suppose confession runs in the family, huh?" I wanted to slap the grin off his face, but instead I stood tall, my voice calm as storm water. "You've been protecting them for decades," I said. "Harold, Reverend Thomas, all of them. You think the Lord's blind to it." He chuckled, leaning back. "Lady, the Lord stopped watching this town a long time ago." He looked at Samuel, his smile hardening. "And you, son, you should have stayed gone. The men you crossed, they don't forget. You've stirred up something you can't put back to sleep." Samuel took a step forward, fists clenched. "I'm not running anymore. You're going to tell me where they are." The sheriff's gaze drifted back to me, that oily calm never leaving his face. "You think you can undo 30 years of filth with one sad little speech?" I raised the pistol and aimed it straight at his chest. The room went still. He let out a low laugh. "You won't do it," he said. "You've been holding on to ghosts too long to make more." Maybe he was right, maybe not, but a mother's heart burns differently. It remembers every bruise, every broken promise. The sound of the shot filled the office like thunder. Papers flew into the air, glass shattered, and the sheriff fell backward, the look of disbelief frozen on his face. Samuel's voice shouted my name, his arms grabbing the gun, pulling it from my hands. I sank into the chair, the world spinning, the air thick with gunpowder and grief. "Mama, what did you do?" he cried. I looked at him, tears blurring his face into shapes of light and memory. "What had to be done?" I whispered. "Someone had to end the curse." He helped me stand, his hands shaking, and together we stumbled into the light outside, the wind whipping through our clothes like an unseen reckoning. I didn't know what would come next, justice, damnation, or both, but for the first time, I felt the weight of silence lift from my chest. The truth had spilled raw and red, and though we both bore its stain, there was a strange, fragile peace in knowing we'd finally torn open the wound instead of pretending it wasn't there. Samuel stood beside me, his shoulders squared against the dying light, and I realized that in the end, a family doesn't survive by keeping secrets. It survives by facing the ruin and still choosing to love through the wreckage. The road ahead was dark, the sirens growing nearer, but I wasn't afraid anymore. The past had finally caught us, and in its merciless grip, we had found something close to freedom. The hours after the shooting crawled by like years, the sirens cutting through the air before dissolving into that awful quiet that always follows a single irreversible act. And I remember holding Samuel's hand as the deputies surrounded us, their voices sharp with panic, their guns raised, though I barely heard them over the sound of my own heartbeat. They took the pistol from him, not me, and maybe that saved my life, because a mother's wrath has a way of burning through reason, and they must have seen it in my eyes. The look of someone who'd lived through too many wars to kneel for one more corrupt man. They led us to the back of a squad car, the town watching from sidewalks and windows, whispers spreading like wildfire through the wind. Some of them I'd known since childhood, faces I'd cooked for, prayed beside, laughed with. And now they looked at me like I was the ghost of everything they wanted to forget. I didn't cry. Not there. Not as they took us into the station. Not even when they handcuffed my son to the table while I sat opposite him. the smell of gun oil and dust heavy in the air. "It was self-defense," Samuel said to the deputy, his voice even, his eyes fixed on me. He reached for the drawer. "You saw it." The deputy, a young man named Carson who'd gone to school with Mary, looked unsure, torn between duty and disbelief. "We'll let the sheriff's office in Wichita sort that out," he muttered before leaving us alone. For a moment, the silence felt merciful. Then Samuel spoke softly. "Mama, if this goes wrong, I want you to say it was me who fired." My head snapped up. "No," I said. "You've spent your whole life paying for other people's cruelty. I won't let you carry mine." But he shook his head, tears gathering slow and deliberate in his eyes. "If they put you away, it'll kill Mary. You know that. She needs you." The mention of her name reopened everything inside me that I tried to brace shut. Mary, bright, beautiful Mary, who had always been light and shadow, laughter and grief. "Well, tell the truth," I said, my voice trembling. "All of it." He smiled gently, almost sadly. "Mama, truth never saved this family. It just broke us slower." I wanted to argue, to make him believe redemption was something more than silence, but the cell door opened, and there she was, Mary, standing small and pale in the hallway, her coat wet from rain. She looked older than I remembered, lines of worry tracing her still soft face. "Mama," she whispered, stepping toward me. But then her eyes landed on Samuel and filled with something tangled, pain, anger, love. "They told me," she said, voice cracking. "They told me everything." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then she walked to Samuel, hand trembling, touching his cheek, and whispered, "You should have told me sooner." He bowed his head, guilt collapsing him. "I was trying to protect you." She shook her head, tears spilling. "You can't protect anyone with lies. Look what it's done to us." Her words tore through the room like broken light, and I felt the breath catch in my throat. The deputy returned, announcing that the state investigators were on their way, that we'd be held until morning. They separated us then, took Samuel to another cell down the hall, left me with Mary in the cold waiting room. For hours we sat in silence, the rain hammering the roof until the world outside disappeared. She turned to me finally, her voice low. "Mama, when I got that letter from the man in Oklahoma, the one who warned me about Samuel, I didn't tell you everything. He wasn't some stranger. He was George Miller's son." My fingers froze around the edge of the chair. "Your uncle's boy," I whispered. She nodded. "He said his father was killed because of something Samuel got involved in. But he also said he didn't want revenge. He wanted to finish what George started. He said the men running this town were still operating through the sheriff, through the church, even through the mill." I could feel my blood run cold. The same names, the same rot, still pulsing beneath the skin of this town. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, though I already knew. She had inherited my silence, that cursed instinct to protect by omission. She looked toward the cell door where Samuel's shadow flickered from the light inside. "Because I thought if I kept quiet, maybe we'd all finally be safe." I reached for her hand, old bones aching, heart breaking under the weight of what I'd passed down. Outside, the dawn crept pale and uncertain across the horizon, and through the thin glass, I heard the low hum of engines approaching, the investigators, or maybe something worse. Mary's grip tightened on mine. "Mama," she whispered, "if they find out the truth about the gun, they'll take him away for good." I looked at her then, and something fierce rose up inside me, as strong as it had been the day I gave birth to each of them. "Then they'll have to take me first." She cried softly, resting her head on my shoulder, and in that moment, I realized that perhaps this was the punishment for every mother who had ever kept a secret thinking it was love, to watch her children break beneath the echo of her silence. As the door opened and uniformed men stepped inside, light spilling across the floor, I straightened my back and whispered to Mary, "Whatever happens next, you remember this. We are Whitfields, and the truth, even when it burns, is the only thing that ever set us free." When they came for us that morning, the light was the color of ash, thin and cold, slipping through the blinds like a reminder that daybreak does not always mean salvation. And as they led me out of the station, I could see Samuel watching from behind the glass, his face calm in the way only resignation can make a man calm. The investigators asked their questions, too many, too sharp, and there were moments I almost broke, almost told them that I had pulled the trigger, but the memory of his boyhood eyes stopped me. So I kept my silence, let them build the narrative they wanted. An aging mother protecting her son, a broken war-scarred man trying to right his father's wrongs. They decided to charge Samuel, not with murder but manslaughter, claiming lack of intent, claiming chaos. I watched the gavel fall in my mind long before it ever would in court. After they took him away, Mary and I were sent home to await further questioning, the car ride heavy with words unsaid. The fields passed by like fading ghosts. The same roads where I had once pushed a baby carriage now carried us back from ruin. "Mama," Mary whispered, eyes on the horizon. "Is it wrong that I don't know who to hate anymore?" I turned to her, feeling the years crack open inside me. "Hate's just a kind of grief, child," I said. "And we've had enough of both." That night the house felt emptier than I'd ever known. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like Samuel's steps, every gust of wind like his voice calling my name. I sat at the kitchen table with his letter, one he'd written just before the arrest, folded neatly beneath my teacup. The handwriting trembled with sorrow. He wrote that sometimes the only way to protect a family is to walk into the fire first, that what he'd done wasn't for absolution, but for ending a cycle none of us were brave enough to stop. "Promise me you'll forgive me," he wrote at the end. "Not because I deserve it, but because you deserve peace." I read those words until the ink blurred. Mary came to stand beside me, her fingers brushing mine, and without speaking she handed me another letter, a newspaper clipping tucked inside. It was from the local journal, dated only days before, announcing the closure of the grain mill for federal investigation into fraud and money laundering, naming several local officials under suspicion. At the bottom of the list was Sheriff Dale Coleman. Justice, I thought, in its slow and crooked way, had begun to move. "He started it, Mama," Mary whispered. Samuel's confession made them look deeper. I nodded, though the knowledge tasted bitter. This justice demanded everything from him, yet gave nothing back. Days turned into weeks, each one sharper than the last. I visited Samuel once in the county jail, the gray walls echoing with distant footsteps. He was thinner, paler, but his eyes carried that strange calm again, the calm of a man who had laid down his burden. "The investigators say you might testify," he said quietly. "You can still tell them the truth." I looked at him and shook my head. "The truth isn't a single word, son. It's a lifetime of choices, and we've both said enough." He smiled faintly like he understood and pressed his hand against the cold glass between us. "You always told me love means doing the hard thing," he said. "Maybe you were right." I wanted to hold him just once more, to feel the weight of his head against my shoulder the way I used to when thunder scared him. But the guard called time, and I was left with the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. A week later, a letter came from the prison chaplain, saying Samuel had been transferred to another facility for his own safety. That was how they phrased it, for his own safety, as if the world had ever granted him any. I walked the fields behind our house that evening, bare feet sinking into the cold earth, and for the first time since that night, I let myself cry, not the quiet, measured tears of old age, but the wailing grief of a mother who has seen too much. I cried for Harold, for George, for the ruin this family carried through generations, and for the boy who had tried to break its chain. Mary found me there, kneeling in the dirt, and didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around me, and we stayed that way until the stars came out. "It's over," she said softly, but I knew that nothing ever truly ends. It only settles into the bones of those left behind. Yet as I looked up at the wide sky, the stars trembling like tiny acts of forgiveness, I felt something stirring deep in my chest, faint but real, a beginning where I thought there'd be none. "Maybe, child," I whispered, "maybe now it can finally change." And the wind moved through the fields like a sigh, carrying the names of those we'd lost, not as curses anymore, but as prayers. Winter came early that year, sliding in without warning, and the frost settled over our land like a shroud, whispering reminders of all that had been buried and all that refused to stay that way. Mary and I spent our days in quiet routines, repairing the house, tending the last of the hens, pretending normal was something you could stitch together out of grief. But at night, when the fire dimmed low and the silence grew heavy, I'd still hear Samuel's voice, soft and distant, carried on the wind like unfinished prayer. Weeks had passed since his transfer, and not a single letter had arrived. Worry began to gnaw at me, subtle at first, then relentless. He promised he'd write. I told Mary one morning as I folded the same apron twice, my mind unraveling into the seams of memory. Maybe the letter got lost, she said, but we both knew better. Letters from prisoners rarely lose their way. They just stop coming when something goes wrong. 2 more weeks slipped by before a knock came at our door. It was Deputy Carson, hat in hand, snow melting from his coat. One look at his face and my legs went weak. He didn't have to speak, but he did anyway, quiet and halting. Mrs. Whitfield. There was an incident during transport. There was a crash. The prisoners, some didn't make it. The words floated through the air like smoke, impossible to grasp. Your son. Samuel, he was one of them. I remember sinking down right there on the porch, the cold rushing up to meet me like mercy denied. Mary cried out, a sound that seemed to tear something open in the sky. And I wanted to hold her, but my own body felt far away, like I was watching another woman break apart while the winter watched, unfeeling. After the deputy left, we sat together until darkness swallowed the house, candles burning low, grief settling into the corners where light refused to linger. I thought of the boy who once gathered wildflowers for me, who carried other people's sins until his heart couldn't hold any more, and I wondered if heaven would know what kind of man he was. A week later, I received a small box from the prison chaplain, Samuel's belongings. Inside was his Bible, worn and marked with notes along the margins, and a photograph of us from long ago, taken on a summer day when the world had still felt wide and kind. But there was something else, too, a folded note tucked inside the back cover. In that same trembling handwriting, he had written, Mama, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home, but please know I found peace in the knowing. We were redemptions of each other, you and I. Tell Mary not to run from her truth. Tell her the Whitfields are finally free. I read it over and over until the ink bled from my tears. For days I couldn't speak. Grief is a strange companion. It doesn't knock anymore once it learns your address. It simply walks in and sits where it pleases. Mary tried to keep me eating, talking, even laughing once in a while, but the laughter fell flat, like a memory of happiness rather than the thing itself. Then one evening, when the sun bled red behind the horizon, she came to me holding a newspaper. Mama, she said, her voice trembling, you need to see this. There, printed on the front page, was an article about the federal investigation widening. The headline read, Corruption Network Falls, Sheriff Linked to Statewide Syndicate. Among the names listed of those arrested and charged posthumously with criminal conspiracy was Samuel Whitfield. My knees gave way, but Mary caught me. Don't you see, she whispered. He didn't die in vain. He brought it all down. They're finished, Mama. It's finally over. But I couldn't bring myself to feel relief. Not yet. Justice and grief are cousins. They share the same blood, but only one ever stays the night. I went out to the field that evening, the same one where Harold once tilled the earth, where Samuel used to chase fireflies until his laughter filled the dusk, and I stood there beneath the bruised sky, the cold wind cutting through the quiet. I brought his Bible with me and laid it gently beneath the oak tree, pressing my palm against the earth. "Rest," I whispered. "The fight's done." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of earth and smoke, and for the first time, I felt something shift inside me, a loosening of the grief's cruel grip. Mary joined me, slipping her arm around my waist, and together we watched the horizon darken into night. "He wanted you to forgive yourself," she said. "It's what he'd want most." I nodded slowly. "Maybe one day," I murmured, "but not tonight. Tonight we remember." So we stood there, two Whitfield women under the wide, mournful sky, no longer running from the ghosts that had defined us, but standing still enough for their voices to fade into peace. And in that stillness, I understood at last that tragedy doesn't end with death. It ends when love, tired and scarred, decides to keep breathing anyway. Spring came late that year, hesitant and fragile, the kind that creeps in quietly after too harsh a winter, as though afraid to wake the grief still sleeping in the soil. And in that tender stillness, Mary and I began to stitch together a new way of living, half memory, half survival. The farm had grown tired, its fences leaning, its fields stubborn with weeds, but there was comfort in the routine of tending it, in the rhythm of things that asked for nothing but patience. Each morning I'd walk to the oak tree where Samuel's Bible lay buried. The earth now settled soft over it, and I'd talk to him. Not in prayers, not anymore, but in the plain language of mothers and sons, the kind that rises from memory instead of faith. I planted roses, the yellow ones you liked, I'd say, my hands trembling as I brushed away the leaves. They're slow to bloom, but maybe they'll take. Mary said I was talking to myself. Maybe she was right, but the truth was I could still feel him in small things, the warm pulse of sunlight through the curtains, the creak of the floorboard near the kitchen window, the way the wind seemed to pause when I whispered his name. Some evenings she'd find me sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon where the sky met the fields, and she'd bring me tea and talk about her plans to sell the last of the land, to move to the city, to finally let go of the shadow this place had cast. I listened, nodding, though part of me knew I'd never leave. Some roots dig too deep to ever be pulled free. One night, as rain fell gentle against the roof, Mary joined me on the porch again, holding a worn envelope in her hand. "It came today," she said, her voice lighter than I'd heard in months. Inside was an official letter, formal, cold, and distant, but the last paragraph caught my eye. The investigation was complete. The network that had begun with Harold and the mill, that had poisoned this town for decades, had finally been dismantled in full. For the first time in years, the Whitfield name appeared in writing unbound from shame, recognized, in fact, for helping expose the corruption that had festered here so long. Mary smiled through tears as I read it, her hand clutching mine. "He did it, Mama," she said softly. "Samuel changed everything." I wanted to smile too, but all I could manage was a breath that felt soaked in sorrow and pride. He did, I whispered, though it cost him everything. She rested her head on my shoulder, and we sat there, rain drumming steady against the porch roof, as the scent of wet earth filled the air. The next morning, I woke before dawn, restless, drawn to the oak tree again. The world was gray and soft with dew, and a thin mist veiled the ground. I knelt there, tracing the damp soil where his Bible rested, and whispered, "You can rest now, my boy. The chains are broken." A single yellow rose had bloomed overnight, small but bright against the darkness of the soil, and I felt something inside me loosen, something that had been clenched for years. I carried that rose inside and placed it in a glass of water by the window, letting the sunlight catch it as morning broke. Later that day, I found Mary packing her things, letters, photographs, odds, and ends of a life too heavy to carry whole. She told me she'd found work in Kansas City, said she needed to start fresh. I smiled and wished her well, even helped her fold the dress she planned to wear on her first day. "You sure you'll be all right here alone?" she asked, the same concern I'd once asked her as a little girl frightened by thunder. "I've been alone before," I said gently, "but I won't be lonely. Not here." When she left, the house felt quiet again, not heavy this time, just still, like an old song that knows all its verses have been sung. That evening, I sat at the table with a cup of tea and watched the wind roll over the fields. The radio played softly in the background, news of the town rebuilding, of the mill site being turned into something new, maybe a library or a park. The world moves on, I thought. It always does, even after we think it can't. I reached for Samuel's photograph, brushing the dust from its cracked frame, and smiled. "You see, son," I said to the empty room, "the world didn't end after all. You gave it back to us." Outside, the sun slipped behind the hills, painting the horizon gold, and for the first time in decades, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something terrible to come. I was simply alive, older, yes, more shadow than light, but alive all the same. The house creaked and settled as the night came on, and somewhere in the gentle hush of the wind, I thought I heard his voice, soft, steady, full of peace, saying, "Thank you, Mama." I closed my eyes, letting the sound linger until it became part of the quiet. And when I finally opened them again, the last light of day had touched the yellow rose on the windowsill, turning it to something holy. It has been 2 years since the day Mary left for Kansas City, and the seasons have turned through their quiet revolutions, each one folding itself into the rhythm of my old bones. And though this house still carries more ghosts than guests, I have learned to live among them with a kind of peace I never thought possible. The fields have changed. Wildflowers have claimed the edges Harold once plowed, and every spring a new nest appears under the eaves, a small miracle born from ruin. People still come up the dirt road sometimes, neighbors, church women, a reporter once, all curious about the house at the end of Miller Creek, the one that belonged to the family whose name once whispered shame and now carries the echo of redemption. They never stay long. Perhaps it's the silence that unsettles them, or the way I speak of the past not as tragedy, but as testament. When they ask about Samuel, I don't tell them about the sorrow, the guns, the guilt. I tell them he was brave, that he fought a darkness most men wouldn't face, that he gave his life to cleanse the soil of its oldest curse. When I speak his name that way, the air softens, and for a moment, it's as if the years roll back and he is still my little boy. Muddy knees and a grin too big for his face. Mary writes often now. Her letters are filled with small apartments and big dreams, promotion at work, a neighbor she might be sweet on, talk of opening a small bakery, because she says the smell of bread reminds her of home. She always ends her letters the same. I'm proud of us, Mama. And I suppose she should be. This bloodline that once carried only sin now carries something gentler, something earned. I've slowed down a lot since then. My hair, once silver, has turned the pale white of frost, and some mornings when I rise, the world spins like an old record caught on one note too long. Still, I sit by that window every dawn, watching the light spill over the oak tree outside, the same tree that keeps Samuel's Bible resting under its roots, and I pray not for salvation anymore, but for gratitude, for the strange mercy of having lived long enough to understand the ending. I've stopped asking why life breaks us and started asking how we keep mending. On the anniversary of his death, Mary drove down with a bouquet of yellow roses, and together we walked out to the field where the last winter had nearly buried our hope. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. She placed the roses at the base of the tree, her fingers brushing the bark, and I swear the wind rose up just then, warm and light, swirling the petals until they scattered into the air like blessings. He's here, she whispered, and I nodded, unable to keep the tears from falling. As we stood there, sunlight breaking through the clouds, I realized something that took a lifetime to learn, that the truest redemption doesn't come from vengeance or justice, but from the quiet choice to keep loving in a world that has forgotten how. That night, after she left again, I stayed out on the porch until the stars appeared, their shine blurred by the mist of my old eyes. I thought about every face that had passed through my story: Harold, George, Reverend Thomas, Sheriff Coleman, all the men who thought they owned the world and ended up buried by their own pride. I thought of Samuel, who carried their ghosts and turned them into light. And I thought of Mary, who would carry that light further still. There, under the vast hush of the Kansas sky, I made peace with them all. I whispered their names one by one, not as curses, but as soft farewells. When I finally rose to go inside, I caught a glimpse of something through the window, the reflection of my own face beside Samuel's photograph, lit by the lantern's glow, as if our two worlds had overlapped for just a heartbeat. It's time, I said quietly to the room, to the ghost, to myself. We're finally free. And when the wind moved through the fields, carrying the scent of roses and rain, I heard his voice again, gentle, sure, and close as breath, saying, I know, Mama. I know. Then the night went still, not empty, just full of peace, and I sat back in my chair, eyes closed, the sound of the wind rocking the old porch in rhythm with the pulse that still, despite everything, refused to stop beating.